I don't know, I'm curious, in your conversations and in the things that you studied, have you heard of places that are handling it in an appropriate way, in a way that's not extreme, but in a way that's understanding of the reality of the situation?
Yeah. So the short answer to the question is no, but I will give a longer answer to that. The reason it's no is because many organizations are really, they're scared of this stuff. They're scared because it's a big liability, and so we are reactive instead of being proactive. We put in conduct codes and dress codes when there's been a violation, instead of sort of being proactive with, this is what the situation is, let's do something about it. I think same with, to pick up on what you're saying with Tom Hanks and sort of the Me Too movement and lots of the conversations that have been happening, when objectionable behavior is part of the culture, people tolerate it more, even if it's not okay. And so I think so many actresses, I remember reading um, uh, an op-ed by Selma Hayek after this whole thing, when she was talking about acting in Frida and how challenging that was with Weinstein and everything else. And again, this is the backstory that we don't know. But when you've got someone in a position of power and abusing that power, someone feels like, I'm going to lose my job if I don't perform a certain way, if I don't act a certain way, if I don't engage in the behavior that someone is asking me to do. And so they don't speak out of fear and out of the need to self-protect and self-preserve a position.
Yeah, and it really does pervade certain cultures more than others. I know, in my own background, being in the advertising industry and in the marketing industry, there's a lot of tropes, right? I mean, all you have to do is go back and watch Mad Men, and you'll see all the extreme tropes. And a lot of that stuff has, maybe changed or morphed or whatever it might be, but it didn't, it didn't surprise me. Well, I guess it did surprise me, but it didn't surprise me that there was sort of a culture of drinking around that space and drugs and things like that. And it's one of a few reasons, but one of the reasons that I felt, getting into education was maybe going to be a better move for me. Because people, you just compare happy hour in advertising versus a dinner with a bunch of people who work in education, and it's like
Yeah.
13 bottles of wine versus 2 glasses. It's a
Yeah.
very, very different, very
Yeah.
different dynamic. And so
Yeah.
clearly this, is very much dependent on different cultures and different workplaces and things like that.
Well, and I also,
Yeah.
go ahead, Martin.
No, 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 keep
Well,
going.
I was just going to say, I think when there's an element of looser boundaries and the element of sort of sexual, if not violations, then certainly boundary shifts with what is required of someone on the job, again, you start to internalize it as, okay, this is just sort of something I have to do, and deny that perhaps it's kind of objectionable. The fact that in certain jobs, I'm thinking about people in the sex industry or people who work at Hooters, where your sexual presence is part of the business model. And so you start to be okay with things that maybe aren't that okay for you, but because that's sort of the mentality of the organization or the ethos of a certain place, you accept things that maybe aren't necessarily acceptable in your mind.
And I think it's becoming more prevalent and more visible, as well as like the rise of influencers and YouTubers and OnlyFans celebrities. Like there's this, what was it? Bad Baby just came out with an OnlyFans on her 18th birthday, and it became one of the highest paid things that just happened. And she got famous for being a jerk on Dr. Phil. Like the world doesn't really make a lot of sense anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's a lot of craziness going on, and especially in the YouTube space, I think in the past month there's been tons of stories coming to light, and they're filming everything all the time, right? So
Yes.
they have people signing NDAs just to enter a home. There's a whole lot of craziness there.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I'm not in the YouTube world, so I don't really have an insight on
Mm-hmm.
watching other
Mm-hmm.
people talk about these things on videos, but the big questions here, like you're saying, is boundaries, right? A big thing that is hard to know is, where are boundaries? Not just boundaries within the workplace, and each workplace's different types of boundaries, but your own boundaries and preferences within that workplace's boundaries, right? So just
Mhm.
because, like you said, Hooters has a dress code that is centered around sexuality, it doesn't mean that each person who's there has the exact same boundary around their own, you know, their own sexuality. And so, um,
Mhm.
especially in these, environments where you've got people who are maybe not in tune with themselves yet, right? Being thrust into an environment that has its own, you know, really kind of clear guidelines of of what it thinks. I'm curious, how do you think someone should navigate that, especially probably early in their career, right? I think there's a lot of harassment and a lot of things that happen to folks early on in their career where they don't really even know themselves yet. What are
Yeah.
some of the things that people can do to understand their own boundaries and bring themselves into the workplace with their boundaries in hand, right? Because in order for you to even know if a line is being crossed, you have to know where your lines are, right?
For sure, for sure. You're reminding me of something that someone once said to me, which is the things you learn in your first full-time job are something you could never get, from your classes. Someone once said something along those lines to me. And I say that to say, though we learn through experience most often, and unfortunately a lot of times, again, we learn through violations. We learn when boundaries are crossed, what doesn't work for us, and we need to work to shift the mindset. Again, my bias is perhaps in psychotherapy, perhaps in meditation, perhaps in journaling, perhaps in conversations with colleagues, but around sort of, what are my boundaries? How far am I willing to go? I know my personality is very social. I like to interact with people. Does that sometimes get taken for granted or get taken out of bounds? Yes. Is it on me then to make sure to implement that limit? Absolutely, because we model the way people treat us on a daily basis, and if we don't implement the way that we want to be treated, people take it as an opportunity to treat us in ways that we don't.